Hello students, today we are going to study kinship. We'll first begin with trying to understand what kinship is. Kinship refers to social relations based on descent and marriage, which means then these are relationships which are based either on relations of blood, which means people who you're related to, like your father, your grandfather, your brother. It also refers to relationships that emerge out of marrying, right? So most societies tend to distinguish between these two categories of relations, which is your blood relations, which are referred to as consanguineous kins, and relations that emerge out of marriage, which are referred to as affinal kins. So basically, when we're talking about affinal kins, we are referring to the in-laws, as it were. Now, kinship does not simply include relationships of descent and marriage, but it also includes other kinds of relationship. For instance, relations of adoption. It also includes relationships that have come into being as a result of reproductive technologies. So say, for instance, today, because of the existence of artificial insemination, you have sperm donors. Because of surrogacy, you have new ways in which one has to imagine what is the domain of kinship. Also, because of changes in law in various countries, today there has been a recognition of queer families, which is men and women of the same sex are allowed to get married. So again, the families they form, and if they adopt children, also starts to constitute the domain of kinship. So what's important here then to understand is that who our kins are is not always a biological given, but it is socially constituted. Now, what do I mean by this? So it is through biological reproduction that some basic kin relations are ordered in society. So for instance, children, parents, grandparents, siblings, so on and so forth. However, because of the presence of reproductive technologies, because of aspects of adoption, what is more important is how is kinship socially recognized. Because even if you recognize biological relationships, you do not know what is the nature of the relationship. What is the behavior, content, rights, obligations that are associated with these relationships, right? Hence, kinship is fundamentally a social phenomenon. Why do we study kinship? Now, the study of kinship has actually been central to the domain of anthropology. The reason being that anthropology in its inception was interested in trying to understand non-Western societies, other cultures. And in trying to understand non-Western societies, it was understood that these societies are kinship-based societies, which means all activities, that is political, economic, social activities, take place through kinship rights and obligations. They do not have differentiated domains like that exists in modern societies. So you don't have a separate economic sphere, political sphere, etc. Everything happens through kin relations and the way in which you're socially located in that society through your various kinds of kinship relations. So then kinship becomes a whole way of life in these societies, and the key ways of deciphering the total form of social organization in stateless non-industrial societies or non-Western societies, as it were. So here an interesting division of labor emerges between the discipline of anthropology and the discipline of sociology. Now, because sociology was fundamentally interested in trying to understand modern society, and in modern societies, because of the segregation and differentiation of domains, you do not see a lot of sociologists paying a lot of attention to kinship, because they thought this was a private domain, and they did not pay as much attention as anthropologists were paying to kinship in smaller societies. Now, in the late 19th century, when these kinds of studies began, the dominant mode of studying kinship was through this idea called the cultural evolutionism. Now, what is cultural evolutionism? It basically involves tracing the historical evolution of kinship forms from the primitive to the modern. Right? So an attempt is made by, say, some important scholars like Henry Louis Morgan, Henry Maine, Johannes Bachofen. All these people, what they tried to do is they tried to arrange various forms of kinship that they saw in different kinds of societies in a hierarchical order, leading to what they understood as civilization. And for them, civilization was represented by their own society, that is Europe. They thought that it is Europe which has reached the stage of civilization, and all other societies are getting there, or are, in other words, judged as backwards. Now, so they constructed different kinds of stages. For instance, Henry Louis Morgan constructed stages like primitive promiscuity, which is a stage where you do not have a lot of taboos around sexuality and a lot of sexual regulation. From primitive promiscuity, you had, say for instance, group marriages. From group marriages, you had polygamy, and eventually from polygamy, it led to monogamy. So this is the way in which he hierarchically arranged kinship forms, saying that one is better than the other, eventually leading to civilization. And civilization was, of course, seen as monogamous unions in European society. Now, this idea of cultural evolution of kinship forms has been thoroughly discredited. And one of the most important proponents of, who criticized cultural evolutionism was A.R. Radcliffe Brown in the early 20th century. He was a British anthropologist. And what he said was that these are basically conjectural histories. And he made this famous statement that the problem is not that they're historical, but the problem is that they are conjectural, which means that they do not give you evidence of the claims of development that they are making, because there were no discoverable laws of social development to validate such theoretical pursuits, right? So because they were based on inadequate knowledge, they become merely conjectures. So this kind of theorizing on kinship was rejected in some sense. And what anthropologists then realize is that their task is to perhaps try and understand contextually the way in which kinship varies from one society to another. Right? Because kinship organization is not the same. As I earlier pointed out to you, that kins are not simply naturally given, they are socially constituted. So hence there is a lot of variable in kinship in different societies historically and culturally, which cannot really be hierarchically arranged, as Radcliffe Brown would point out. And these are the ways in which kinship tends to vary. The first is the extent to which genealogical and affinal relationships are recognized for social purpose. The second, the ways in which relatives so recognized are classified and grouped in social categories. Third, the particular customs by which behavior of these relatives is regulated in daily life. Fourth, the various rights and obligations that are mediated through kinship. And fifth, the linguistic forms which are used to denote the various categories of kin. Now, what do these differences mean? The first is, of course, the extent to which we recognize genealogical and affinal categories. Now, it's interesting to note that we take for granted who our parents are, right? But in many societies, paternity is not resolved, which is to say that while you may know who mothers are, many societies make a distinction between the pater and the genitor. The pater is a socially recognized father, and the genitor is the biological father. I think one easy example would be, for instance, in a particular society, a child may call his father as well as his father's brother by the same term, which is father. So in effect, it appears as though he has two fathers, as it were, because there is a recognition of having more than one father. So again, this is a way in which kinship varies socially. Again, in our society today, because of reproductive technologies, because of surrogacy, you see, again, paternity becomes a problem. So say, for instance, if a gay couple decide to have a child and they employ a surrogate mother, the question then becomes about, who is the father of the child, and how do we conceive of, the relationship between the social mother who may take care of a child and the surrogate mother in some sense. So these create problems of trying to locate parenthood, that paternity and maternity are not always resolved, and they vary from one society to another. Another important way to understand kinship is the fact, kinship variability, is that they are classified and grouped in different kinds of social categories. I'll give you one example, which is that in some societies which have cross-cousin marriages, there is a distinction that is made between cousins in the form of parallel cousins and cross cousins. Now, who are our parallel cousins? Our parallel cousins are children of siblings of the same sex, which basically means, say for instance, my father's brother's child and my mother's sister's child, right? These are my parallel cousins. And cross cousins are those who are children of siblings of the opposite sex. For instance, it means my father's sister's children and my mother's brother's children. Now, in many societies, this distinction is important because societies practice cross cousin marriage. You are supposed to get married to your cross cousin. Now, in many societies, this is not a practice. In fact, all cousins are prevented from marrying the ego. So in such a situation, you will not have this kind of a distinction between parallel and cross cousin. So say in Western society, if you look at it, you have cousins who are distinguished in terms of matters of degree which connote social distance. So you have, for instance, first cousin, second cousin, third cousin. Or say, for instance, cousins of your parents' generation would be referred to as cousins which are once removed, twice removed, etc. So what you see is the way in which kinship terminologies are categorized is different from one society to another. Now, not only is social categorization of kinship different, how you behave with your kins also varies from one society to another. Now, most kins can be imagined as a kind of dyad, right? They are sets of two always. So father, son, mother, daughter, brother-in-law, and nephew. These are the ways in which you conceive of the sets of kins. Now, there are particular kinds of rights, duties, and behavioral expectations that are associated with each set of relationship, and they may vary from culture to culture. Right? For instance, the relationship between a father and a son is often seen as a relationship of authority, right, in most societies, where the father has authority over the child. Now, this is seen as a relation of avoidance because there is this anxiety that eventually it is the child who is going to replace the status of the father and perhaps take over his property, whatever he may have. So this leads to a whole range of rituals and obligations to maintain this distance. For instance, in some societies, the son is not allowed to touch the personal property of the father. Right? Or in some other societies, there is this thing that, if the child decides to shave, or if he smokes or does activities which qualify him as a man, he has to first give some amount of money to his father. Again, in modern societies, the relationship may not be so authoritarian and may become friendly. So again, the content of these relationships also vary from society to society in terms of the way in which we imagine the categorizations. Now, of course, as each of these relationships are also associated, as I was trying to point out to you, with aspects of group membership, transmission of property, and succession to particular status. And this is, of course, more important in smaller societies, whereas I have already told you that kinship-based systems meant that all economic, political activities would take place through your kins. So in such a society, whose group you belong to becomes very important. Do you belong to your mother's group? Do you belong to your father's group? Right? Similarly, for instance, that will determine who you will inherit property from. Right? It will determine who you can marry. Right? And eventually, what status can you take as you mature as a person? So, say for instance, one in the Trobriand Islanders, which is a matrilineal society, which is a society where people are affiliated on the basis of their relationship with their mothers. In such a society, what happens is that the husbands are obliged to gift a proportion of their horticultural produce to their brother-in-law's household. Right? So this is the way in which you see an economic activity or a gift exchange takes place, but it takes place in terms of kinship obligations. So you basically have a husband who has to provide for his brother-in-law to maintain this solidarity of the kinship ties between them. Another way in which, of course, kinship varies is the kind of terms that are used to denote various kinship categories. Now, Henry Louis Morgan provided us with a very exhaustive list of kinship categories. According to him, all forms of kinship can be fundamentally divided into 6 kinship terminological systems, and he named them on the basis of various sort of North American tribes, namely the Omaha, the Crow, the Iroquois, the Sudanese, the Eskimo, and the Hawaiian systems. Now, this can be so all these 6 basically are a variation of 2 fundamental kinds. That is the descriptive and the classificatory system. Now, what is the descriptive and the classificatory system? Now, in a descriptive system, there is a distinction that is made between lineal kins and collateral kins. Now, what is lineal kins and what are collateral kins? Lineal kins are those in direct parent-child relationship. So, grandparents, parents, children. That's lineal kinship. And Collateral kins are all those who are non-lineal kins, such as, for instance, the ego's parents, siblings, and their respective children. I think an easier way to understand is your uncle, aunts, cousins. They all become your collateral kins. Now, in two forms of the system, the Eskimo and the Sudanese system, they are descriptive system, which means that they separate the lineal kins, which another way of thinking is that they separate the nuclear family, which is the parent, child, sibling, grandparents, from the rest of the kins. Right? Now, in some instances, however, you have a classificatory system. In a classificatory system of kinship, the lineal and collateral kins are lumped together. Examples are Crow, Omaha, Iroquois, and Hawaiian. And if you see, for instance, in the Omaha system, it's interesting that the ego is the self from where I take, I map out my kinship ties. So in the Omaha system, the ego's father, his father's brother are called by the same term, and the ego's mother, mother's sister, mother's brother's daughter, they are all called by the same term. And because the ego calls his parents, siblings as his own mother and father, then their children automatically become his siblings. So you see, what then happens is that this expands the number of fathers you have, the number of mothers you have, and the number of siblings you have, and it's not entirely biological, because these cousins who now become your siblings are really not given birth to by your own parents, as it were. So this is a classificatory system of kinship. Now, following this variability, we'll now try and understand the various forms of descent that has been noted by anthropologists, which spread across different non-Western societies. They are the patrilineal descent, the matrilineal descent, the ambilineal descent, bilateral descent, parallel descent, cross and double descent. Now, what are unilineal descent groups? Now, unilineal descent groups are groups where the affiliation is based on either male or female descent links, and such groups are known as unilineal descent groups. Now, there are two fundamental kinds of unilineal descent group. The first is, of course, the patrilineal descent, which involves affiliation of kins through the male line, that is father to children, which means in a patrilineal group, you have the father, you have his children, including the girl child, and you have the son's children in the next generation, but not the children of the daughter, because you are linking the group only through male line and not the female line. The alternate form of unilineal descent group is, of course, the matrilineal descent group, which involves the reverse, which is affiliation of kins through females only, that is mother to children. So say if you look at a 3-generation model, the mother, the mother's children, and then her daughter's children will actually belong to the same group. Next, we have ambilineal descent. Now, in the ambilineal descent, it's a rare form of descent. It's seen among the Samoans of the South Pacific. What you notice is that some individuals get affiliated in terms of the matrilineal principle, which is they get affiliated to the father's group, and some individuals get affiliated to the mother's group. Now, ambilineal systems are often associated with societies where there is a decline of the unilineal descent systems, and hence you have this alternating forms of system where these matrilineal and ambilineal systems are, as it were, combined. The next form of descent system is often associated with modern society, which is the bilateral system. Now, in this society, what happens is that the entire understanding of kinship is egocentric. It is centered on the self, and it is two-sided, which means that my relatives on my father's side as well as my mother's side are equally important or equally unimportant. And my sense of belonging has to be social or emotional. It is not about group membership, because I belong equally to either both or to neither of them, right? So often modern societies, Western societies, have this kind of kinship where your kins are simply your relatives who you are in touch with, who you are close to, who you invite at the various ceremonies that you have, say for instance, marriage, funerals, etc. Right? So this is bilateral kinship, which is egocentric. Then there are two very rare forms of kinship. One is the parallel system of descent, which involves a situation where sons get affiliated to father's patrilineal group and daughters to the matrilineal group. Right? So this may create monosexual kin group. So you have all men which belong to one group and all women belonging to another. The cross system of descent is a situation where men belong to the mother's group and women belong to the father's group. In some societies also what you have is what has been referred to as the double descent system. Now in a double descent system what happens is that the same individual is simultaneously affiliated to the matrilineal group as well as the patrilineal group. Now why does this happen? Why does the same person belong to two different groups? Now this may be because certain forms of inheritance takes place through the patrilineal group, while certain other forms of inheritance may take place through the matrilineal group. So say for instance a son may receive certain kinds of immovable property from his father, right? But he may receive livestock or forms of movable property from his mother's group. So this is the form of double descent system. Now, another important concept that anthropologists work with in trying to understand kinship in smaller societies is that they make a distinction between what they call, of course, lineages and clans. So a lineage is a set of kins who trace their descent from a known common ancestor, which means however many generations you go back in, you're able to tell who was the person who you were related to. Now this is distinguished from clans. Clans are composed of groups who acknowledge a putative common ancestor. Putative means it's sort of fictional, right? You don't have a real person but a imputed person. Now clans often identify with themselves with totems. Now what are totems? Totems can be plants, animals, objects which sort of signify the identity of the clan, and that they are considered to be sacred, and the whole range of rituals that are associated with them, and sometimes clans can think that they have originated from these totems. Now it's important to understand that often lineages are a territorial unit. Now what do I mean by this? Which means that in a particular village it is the lineage that is inhabiting that village. Sometimes it is also clans. Clans are however an exogamous unit. Now what does that mean? Exogamy basically refers to a situation where you can only marry somebody outside your group. So in case of members of the same clan cannot marry within the clan, they have to marry outside the clan, right? Now like we had patrilineage and matrilineage, as I had told you when I was talking about descent systems, we can also have matriclans and patriclans. Now as I was telling you that kinship organization is very central to the way in which social life takes place in smaller societies, right? And many of these societies, the functional unit for carrying out a whole range of activities is the unilineal descent group. And I've already told you there are two fundamental kinds of unilineal descent group, which is the matrilineal and the patrilineal descent group, and they carry out a whole range of functions, right? A whole range of economic, political, familial, religious functions, which in modern societies would be very segregated, but in small societies are carried by these UDGs, right? And these UDGs are corporate in nature, which means that they often jointly own property, right? And they function as one singular unit. So even if it has individual members, they see themselves as parts of one whole, which is this UDG. Now what are the functions of UDG? Some of the major functions of UDG is that it regulates marriage. Now if you remember, I'd already told you that clans is the exogamous unit in kinship, which means so are lineages. So often it is on the basis of your UDG that you get to that decisions around marriage are taken. So who can a member of the UDG marry depends on the way in which the lineage is imagined. So regulating marriage is an important function of the UDG. The second is of course economic functions. As I'd already pointed out that these functions may not be very distinct as it may be in modern societies, but nonetheless the UDG is imagined as a land owning unit, right? And as a land owning unit, it basically offers mutual aid and economic cooperation among the members, which is they may work together and share work and share what they have produced, right? At the same time, they may also engage in activities. Say for instance, when a bride price has to be given during marriage, they all come and contribute together. So whenever it is about certain kinds of transactions and gifts and ceremonial gift giving, the entire UDG functions as one group and enables this these kinds of gifts exchange and forms of production, etc. Political functions. Now, it's important to understand that most of these small simple societies are not state societies. They do not have a conventional state in the way we understand it, right? So when we're talking about political decision making, we're basically talking about the way in which members in the group are hierarchized. So often what happens is the eldest male member takes political decisions, right? He decides, how will the cultivable land be allotted, right? He decides, say for instance, how will the produce of a particular season be distributed. He decides, for instance, how will warfare take place, because often what happens in simple societies, right, there is a lot of fighting that goes on with the neighbors. Sometimes, of course, there is also fighting within the group, and here I think that the village headman or the tribal chief may play a very important role in trying to manage conflicts, trying to settle conflicts, etc. So these are seen as political functions. And finally, you have religious functions, because there are a whole range of religious beliefs, especially totemic and animistic beliefs, that are associated with these kinship-based systems, which engage in ancestral worship and so on. So a lot of, the kind of rituals that these groups perform again determine on the way in which they understand their group membership through the unilineal descent group. Now, it is important to understand that this mode of thinking about kinship, and particularly trying to think about kinship in simple societies, has been sort of criticized. Now, one of the reasons why this has been criticized is because of the normativity it produced. What do we understand by normativity? Now, what it means basically is that the moment you try, when Western scholars went and tried to understand kinship-based systems and told you this is how they function, etc., it appears as though they were creating abstract models of their functioning, and there seemed to be a gap between how they were supposed to function according to the way in which anthropologists were talking about them and how they actually functioned. So what that led to was that that there seemed to be a kind of gap between what anthropologists were trying to say about the way in which kinship functioned and the way in which actually it functioned. So this criticism of the study of kinship, particularly through the structural functional mode, where you're trying to understand how kinship leads to the devolution of certain kinds of functions in society, was much criticized, and hence that produced a certain kind of sensitivity to this gap, that there is a gap between the normative way in which kinship happens and the way in which empirically it actually happens in society. So people have become sensitive now to the gaps between the official and the practical models in sort of kinship studies. Now, because of the kind of critiques that were leveled against the dominant structural functionalist approach to kinship, what happened is by the 1970s and 1980s, sort of kinship became marginal. The studies of kinship sort of started receding from the domain of anthropology. If you see, interestingly, kinship always involves women. It involves reproductions, it involves marriage, so hence it involves women. But very interestingly, when scholars were trying to study kinship, they often concentrated on relationships between men, and hence they were more interested in the more economic and political dimensions of, say, for instance, eulogies of these simple societies rather than their domestic arrangements, because they thought that the domestic arrangements, which fundamentally involved the mother and the child, were basically more natural units, and this was outside the purview of study. At the same time, you see there is a growing acceptance of queer relationships, homosexual relationships. As I'd already mentioned, that there has been a legalization of queer marriages, transgender marriages, etc. And what these forms of relationship do is that they make us confront then the domains of kinship, and they make us sort of relook and revise what we mean by kins in that sense, and hence this has led to a resurgence of trying to understand who our kins are and what kinship means in a ever-changing society, where you have reproductive technology, where you have new ways in which people are expressing their identity and their personhood, and they're relating to each other in different ways. Thank you.